Hello, and welcome to another episode of Joe and Cat Chats. Okay, today we're talking about employment. It's a really timely episode, and I'm excited to get into it. But first, how are you, Joe?
You know what, Miss Wells? I'm patient. I'm feeling good, and now more than ever, I'm trying to figure out this fundamental question. What do we do between the womb and the tomb? And I'm going to say that again for everybody that's watching right now. What do we do between the womb and the tomb? And so much of what we do between the womb and the tomb is going to be covered in today's conversation, because employment, work, we spend a lifetime working. We try to find a job that gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of being, a reason to get up early in the morning and a reason to stay up late at night, a reason to give a little extra because you enjoy what you do for a living. Work is a sense of pride. It's a sense of status. It's a sense of dignity. It's a sense of self-respect. So again, the fundamental question that I want to make sure that we try to answer today, or at least have a little bit more insight on, is what do we do between the womb and the tomb? And that is what we're going to try to figure out today in today's episode of the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, the Joe and Cat Chat series. How are you, Cat?
Awesome.
Well?
Yeah, no, that's great. I love the way you put that. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's been a wild week, but we're getting through it, and we're doing good. I think. We'll see about the world. But I just wanted to make a note. I think some people might be expecting us to be talking about what happened in Washington last week, because it happened just the day after our last week's episode. And to that, I just wanted to say that if anyone's interested, you can go to Joe's Instagram or Facebook page at Joe Nice DJ and watch any of the videos that you posted in the past week, because I mean those are absolutely necessary. I think your rage was justified. I think your compassion was well-founded, and I think your logic and arguments are sound and thoughtful. And then if anyone wants to further the conversation, we are also both going live tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with the Fear and Loving podcast with our buddy Ranch and some amazing other people.
And Rue Johnson is going to be there. It's going to be an incredible conversation, and it's episode 8. And episode 8 is going to talk about the divided states of America.
Exactly. Yeah, I love Rue. Yeah, it's going to be a great one. So tune in, everybody who wants to catch a live discussion. Submit your thoughts and questions there. But as for today, Joe and Cat Chats, we're back at it. We are talking employment. And just like you so eloquently said, this is a big topic. This is what we do between birth and death. Yeah. This is what fills most of our time.
Womb in the tomb. What do? Yeah. You typically, unless you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, you're typically working.
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of people as a result of this pandemic who are not working.
Yeah.
And when I mentioned this in a previous Joe and Cat Chats episode, where I mentioned the famed sociologist Emile Durkheim, where he talks about a word that he came up with called enemy, which is a sense of lawlessness. And you have that when people don't know what to do with themselves. And there's a whole lot of people right now that don't know what to do with themselves because what they used to be doing is no longer available to them. I used to travel the world and play shows in far-flung exotic places and spend, I don't know, I guess 35 to 45% of my time in airports. I haven't seen an airport since March 23rd of last year.
Right.
Now what?
Yeah.
There's a plenty of people who are in a similar position than I am. And it's not necessarily from a music perspective. There are people who used to work at a bar, used to work at a restaurant, used to work as a chef, used to work at your local Jiffy Lube or your local grocery store or your local lumber yard or your local, HVAC place. And now it's like, okay, damn, I can't do this anymore. Now what?
Yeah. Yeah. And those are all really important questions for those of us who are in precarious jobs, who don't have jobs, who, are shifting, transitioning. All sorts of things can affect your work and your employment. So we're going to get into it, and hopefully we'll have some time to get into a little bit more of the nuances as well within employment. But first, do you want to define employment for us?
Absolutely. And we got some comments coming in already. We'll get to them in a couple of minutes. All right, we'll get some people in. Employment is basically having a paid job. It's being paid to work. It's like, hey, I am a chef. I cook. I get paid to cook. I am a DJ. I get paid to play music. That is what I do. Now, work is any activity that an individual engages in to earn wages. That is actually, and again, notice the subtle nuance between the definitions. Employment is simply having a job. Work is the activity that actually pays you to do what you are doing. So the terms are related, but they're not brother sister. They're more like cousins.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and when I was looking into this to prepare for today's episode, I really wanted to say kind of what was missing in sort of the definitions, because employment is just the condition of having paid work. But I think that the important aspect that was missing there is that you're basically selling your body in exchange for something, whether it's intellectual knowledge, something that you've been trained to do, or physical labor itself, emotional labor, etc. There's all sorts of kinds of work. And I think that is captured more in the word labor, which is, I would argue, something that includes work, but it also includes emotional, physical, psychological labor. That it's something that you have to put effort into.
Kat, you're 1,000% correct, because I was just going to say, hey, you know what? There's a whole other part to this called labor.
Yeah.
And what I have in my notes right here is physical and or mental work.
Right.
That's basically everything what you just said. And just for everybody that's watching right now, it's not like Kat and I exchange notes before we do this, because you got all your stuff that you're doing doing your research, I'm doing my research, and we put our heads together, and then it's like, hey, you know what? We give birth to Joe and Kat chats every week. But it's not like we had to say, you said labor, and I was like, oh gosh, you peeking over my notes yesterday? I mean, this is what it was. So labor, and just so we understand, we have three different types of labor. Okay, you have unskilled labor. It's basically labor that has no particular skills or education. Then you have semi-skilled, where you have some education, and then you have skilled labor, where you have specialized training that requires a particular, or as Liam Neeson in the movie Taken said, I have a particular set of skills. That is skilled labor. And if you remember that, and as an aside, the first Taken was the best of the three Takens.
I haven't seen any of them.
We'll just leave it at that. Now, examples of unskilled labor: janitors, maids, parking lot attendants. It doesn't take a whole lot of education to clean a toilet or vacuum a floor or make sure people's cars are parked in between the lines that are painted on the pavement. Yeah. Semi-skilled, bartenders. It takes a certain amount of skill to know how to make a Long Island iced tea. Waiters. It takes a certain level of skill to make sure that your order is taken properly. Okay. Sometimes if you don't pay attention and that steak comes out well done when the customer wanted it medium rare, it takes a certain amount of skill to be able to pay attention and listen. Listening is skill. Being a security guard, it takes a certain amount of skill to make sure that a particular area is protected. And then skilled labor, massage therapists. It takes a while to figure out which muscles and how to manipulate the body so you feel well. Electricians, you want to be an electrician, you're looking at least at a 4-year apprenticeship. That is a particular skill, and not everybody knows how to be an electrician. Nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists. You go to school for these things. Dentists, you go to school to be a dentist. And then there's, even with other types of skilled labor, there are other types of skilled labor that are more than just being able to build an app or balance a checkbook. I mean, when you talk about the medical field, it takes a long time to acquire those skills to be known as skilled labor. So yeah, 3 types of labor: unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled.
Okay. Yeah, and I kind of see these as building upon each other. And I think in the system that we have set up, capitalism itself, these are sort of set up in a way where, the unskilled labor usually has the lowest sort of wage. And then you build up to like a skilled position where it has the highest wage most of the time, I would say, as a general rule. And I think that there's a lot more nuance to that than it appears, but that's sort of how we structure our society right now, which I can criticize later because I can get into some more nuances, with alienation, which is a term that comes from Marxist theory. Absolutely. But we'll put pause on that for now.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's wonderful that you mentioned pay, and I guess that hierarchy of payment, because typically your unskilled laborers are your lowest paid and your skilled laborers are your highest paid. And since you mentioned Marxist, when we talk about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, when we talk about the bourgeoisie being the business owners or the elites and the proletariats being the workers, there is going to be an inherent conflict between those who control the means of production and those who are the actual producers. And there is typically an intermediary between those who control the means of production and those who are the producers. And that intermediary is known as a labor union.
Yeah.
Known as a labor union. And labor unions, it's an association of workers that represent the rights of the workers. Make sure that there's 3 goals that every labor union has: better pay, more reasonable hours, and improved worker safety.
Nice. Yeah, this is an interesting thing to be talking about because when you define it like that, it seems like such a great thing. But there's a lot of people who are against labor unions.
Of course there are.
Yeah.
Of course there are. And there's plenty of reasons why businesses would be against labor unions. But in reality, there are some employees that are against labor unions. Mm-hmm. Now, one reason as to why employees would be against labor unions is because if you want to belong to a labor union, you have to pay a certain amount of money to participate in that labor union. Yeah. Those fees that you pay to the labor union, so the labor union can represent you against the employer, those are called dues. Mm-hmm. And sometimes dues come out of your paycheck. And if you are a semi-skilled or even an unskilled worker, the difference between, $40 a paycheck or $50 a paycheck over a year is a significant sum of money if you're making $30,000 a year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that could be a week's groceries for you and your family.
That could be gas money.
Yeah.
That could be a co-payment at a doctor.
Yeah.
Okay, it's money you're talking about. Now, when we have this sort of meeting of the minds between the labor union that represents the workers and you have the management or the ownership, the business owners, they come to an agreement. They say, hey, you know what? Okay, we the labor union, we represent the workers, and we'll make this concession. The business says, okay, well, you know what? Okay, we'll make this concession. And when both sides come to an agreement, that is called collective bargaining. Mm-hmm. Collective bargaining. You often hear about collective bargaining with respect to sports. For example, the National Football League a couple of years back had a new collective bargaining agreement. At the end of this current NBA basketball season, the NBA Players Association, which is the union that represents every single member of the NBA, which I think there are 400 players in the National Basketball Association, and they are led by a labor lawyer named Michelle Roberts. I think she is out of Washington, D.C., if I'm not mistaken. And she represents the players. And Adam Silver, who is the commissioner of the NBA, represents the business, the ownership, the infrastructure that is the NBA. And Adam Silver, the commissioner, works for the other teams, the owners of each NBA franchise. So you have all the NBA franchise owners, and all of them are billionaires, and they all work. Adam Silver works for them. And then you have Michelle Roberts, who represents all of the players. And they're going to come to some sort of agreement with regards to worker safety, payment, and hours. And when you talk about hours in the NBA, it's, hey, you know what? I don't want to play back-to-back games. That's hard on my knees, and I could twist an ankle and be out for 6 to 8 weeks. Mm-hmm. That's 30 games that I might miss. I don't want to do that. So we're gonna talk about that. Hey, what about TV rights? How much of these TV rights with ABC and ESPN? How much of that money is going to go to the players, and how much of that is going to go to the NBA teams? What about a new drug policy? Marijuana has been legalized in a lot of states. As of right now, marijuana, from what I understand, is a banned substance in the NBA. How are you going to resolve that conflict or collectively bargain with teams that play in states where marijuana is legal, as opposed to teams in states where marijuana is not legal? Right. What do you do there? How do you collectively bargain that? So Michelle Roberts and Adam Silver, and then a bunch of their lawyers and a bunch of the NBA Players Association lawyers, they're going to go ahead and put their heads together and figure this out. Now, if they don't figure this out, there are a couple of things that could potentially take place. You could have a lockout where right. the business owners, at this point, the NBA says, hey, you know what? If y'all don't want to agree to this, whatever. We don't want to deal with you. Stay away from us. We're not doing anything until you at least come to the table in good faith, because that's what we're going to do. Now, the players could say, hey, you know what? We don't like what the NBA is offering, and we're going on strike. We don't want to do this. And if you go back to, oh gosh, which episode was it? It was episode 2 of Joe and Kat Chats, the protests episode.
Yeah.
About the different types of protests, strikes, vigils, and then I mentioned a specific type of strike called a Wildcat Strike. Now, a Wildcat Strike happens when you have a labor union and you have a union representative. So let's say in this instance, Michelle Roberts, who is the union representative, of the Players Association for the NBA, says, hey, NBA players, we're going on strike because we don't like what the NBA is offering. So the NBA players themselves could say, hey, you know what, Michelle, we don't want to do that. And we're going to do something different. When labor disobeys or chooses to not use union representation and decides to go on strike anyway, that is a specific type of strike called a Wildcat Strike.
Right.
It is a Wildcat Strike. You could also have a sit-in. Now, a sit-in happens when labor sits in the workplace in an attempt to not get locked out.
Yeah.
And you've seen that with a couple of car manufacturers. We've seen that happen. We've also seen slowdowns where workers will not necessarily go on strike, but they'll slow their production down as a warning to labor and management, to business owners and management, saying, hey, look, if you don't treat us right, your production, we will purposely decrease productivity. Mm-hmm. Come back to the table. Let's work with our labor union and get this situation resolved. Or we'll just keep working slow. And you see these car parts, these transmissions, they won't get produced as quickly. And these TVs that you want to sell at Christmas time, we'll make, instead of making 300 a day, we'll make 30 a day. Mm-hmm. So there is that. There's work to rule, where the workers will go ahead and work to the exact specifications in the collective bargaining agreement, but they won't go the extra mile or do anything extra to further or advance productivity. So they will do the bare minimum to make sure that the management says, well, wait a minute, you're not living up to the terms of your contract. Well, labor can go ahead and say, well, yeah, we actually are living up to the terms of your contract. We're doing what you collectively bargained.
Right.
What are you complaining about? What are you dealing with? What's the problem? There's a general strike. When general strikes or mass strikes, which is something I'm a proponent of, now more than ever, is when you have multiple industries and multiple job types that collectively decide to not work. A perfect example of a mass strike is what is happening in India right now. In India right now, you had government workers that were like, yeah, we're not working. Narendra Modi, no, we're not dealing with him. And then farmers are like, hey, you know what, y'all want to eat? Okay, we're shutting it down too. So you have a bunch of government workers that aren't farmers that are saying, hey, you know what, we're shutting it down. And then you have a bunch of farmers that are saying, hey, we're shutting it down. That is a general or a mass strike. And there's another type of strike. It's called the blue flu. The blue flu. And this is something that we didn't talk about in episode 2 of the Joe and Cat Chat series because, we were like, hey, defund the police. But the blue flu happens with regards to the police. And the blue flu is when you have a bunch of police officers that just say, hey, you know what, I'm calling in sick. I don't feel like it. And let's not forget that since police are public employees are generally not allowed to strike based upon the terms of their work agreement. When you have any type of job that involves public safety or public health, and you have people employed in those positions, they are not permitted to strike. So an EMT, a firefighter, police person can't go on strike, but they can certainly protest the terms of their work agreement. And one of the ways they can protest the terms of their work agreement is the blue flu, where a bunch of cops say, yo, you know what? Hey boss, I had some donuts. They were stale the other night. Stomach's bothering me. Can't go to work. Now, a perfect example of the blue flu happened in 2015 in none other than my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay.
Now, in Baltimore, Maryland, you had Stephanie Rawlings Blake, the disgraced mayor, and the Baltimore City State's attorney, a lady by the name of Marilyn Mosby. Now, this is in reaction around April, maybe early May, to the Freddie Gray riots, where Marilyn Mosby said, hey, you know what, we're going to prosecute all these cops and bring them to the fullest, prosecute them and make sure they feel the fullest extent of the law. They killed Freddie Gray. We're going to do something about this. And what happened after that? The Baltimore Fraternal Order of Police, which is the police union, said, oh, really? Oh, you're going to talk to us like this? To borrow a Baltimore phrase, to borrow some Baltimore slang, is this how you want to carry it? Is this really what you want to do? Are you sure you want to talk spicy to us like this, Miss Mosby? Mayor Stephanie, SRB, do you really want to go down this road, talking this mess about us, the police? Don't do this, because crime is difficult enough in Baltimore the way it is. The last thing you want is a rising crime, especially after the Freddie Gray riots. So what happened? A pile of police officers called in sick, a pile of them. And as a result, crime went through the roof in Baltimore. And Baltimore is already a high crime city.
Right.
So these types of actions where employees become dissatisfied with their working agreements or their work arrangements or the terms of their collective bargaining, this is what you call industrial action.
Right. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I didn't know what blue flu was before you mentioned it in your note to me earlier. And so when I was looking it up, it was interesting to me because I read just that historically that the blue flu strikes have helped expand police power because they ultimately limit the ability of city governments to reform, constrain, or conduct oversight over the police. And they allow the police to leverage public fear of crime to extract concessions from municipalities, which is exactly what that example demonstrates. So yeah, so that's a really interesting thing, particularly for those of us who are abolitionists and we don't want the police services to be, around anymore because of the horrendous crimes that they commit, particularly the police brutality against Black people.
Absolutely. So. And again, just to make sure that everybody understands this, these labor unions have their pros and cons. Labor unions have, for years, let's say 100 years ago, labor unions didn't necessarily exist. But so workers you could have a 14-year-old child working at a munitions plant.
Right.
Really? Why? Well, there's no labor unions. There's no workers. There's no standards. There's no nothing. You could say, hey, you know what? Oh, you're a kid. You don't need to go to school. Hey, you know what? Let's have you work in this coal mine. Yeah. There wasn't any of that. So in 1935, the Wagner Act was passed. And you're like, Joe, what exactly is the Wagner Act? I've never heard of this. The Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, it basically said, hey, you know what? Workers, you can unionize. You can unionize. And you can collectively bargain. And you can take certain types of action, like industrial action, like sit-ins, strikes, walkouts. It's actually not necessarily walkouts, because walkouts is from it's from management to labor. Walkouts are actually the opposite of strikes. But work to rule, slowdowns, blue flu. You know what? You can do all that stuff because now we've codified it by law. And we have a set of standards that you all need to adhere to in order to do these activities as prescribed by the Wagner Act. And one of the great presidents of our republic, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed that into law, which makes perfect sense because he also created the Green New Deal, which gave a whole lot of people jobs as a result of post-World War II. So it would make sense that if you're going to have all of these people that are in jobs, you're going to need people that you're going to need some set of standards to represent the rights of the workers. And you're going to make sure that you need to have something in place that is a buffer between workers and management, or really more specifically, workers and business owners. And that is the sole function of a union. So the Wagner Act said, yeah, you know what? Y'all can unionize. If you don't like the collective bargaining, y'all can go on strike because it's in law. Now, a few years later, there were a couple of senators that passed the Taft-Hartley Act. And the Taft-Hartley Act said, you know what? Yeah, we're going to change this whole Wagner Act thing because people are doing well, and we're going to change it up. And we're going to add a list of unfair labor practices to this to the Taft-Hartley Act. But at the same time, we're also going to give states the right to pass right to work laws. We're going to give states the power to pass right to work laws. That's not good. You don't want that, because a right to work law are laws that prohibit collective bargaining between employers and labor unions.
Right.
So one of the worst pieces of legislation that destroyed labor and labor unions is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Mm-hmm. Right. The one piece of legislation that was probably worse is Taft-Hartley, because now states can go ahead and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, no, you can't unionize. You can't collectively bargain, and you have no rights. So when I had that protest list, protest sign, and all the stuff that you want, I think something we should be potentially looking at is repealing Taft-Hartley. Mm-hmm. Repeal that, or at least amend it to prohibit states from preventing workers to collectively bargain and unionize. Because now more than ever, with the rise of centibillionaire oligarchs, it's incumbent that workers unite.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting because the Taft-Hartley Act came into effect in 1947, which was kind of the start, around the start of sort of the neo-liberalism policies that began to sort of chip away at the rights of people in both the United States and Canada. We've talked about it before, and this is a really sort of seminal time where things started to shift, and sort of the conservative versus liberal outlook, the left versus the right outlook, really started to divide a little bit. And although as we've talked about the Overton window, it kind of shifts and goes together, but they really started to chip away at the union ideology that is inherent in most liberal ideologies, I guess. And so, yeah, so, playing on the ideologies of people and how people want jobs, they want to work hard, they want these things to have a good life and a good livelihood, and playing on that to implement legislation that chips away at things like that unionize people, and that, implement protections for people, which is exactly what unions are. So
I couldn't have said it better. I really couldn't have said it better. I couldn't have said it better. And just to provide a little bit more seasoning to what we're cooking up here today. My dad belonged to a union.
Mm-hmm.
My dad learned a trade when he was young. He was a licensed steam fitter and pipe fitter. And he belonged to Local 486 in Maryland. And Local 486 was part of the United Association of Journeymen of Pipe Fitters and Steam Fitters of the United States and Canada. That whole long thing I just said is also abbreviated as the UA. Okay. So something we want to make sure that we specify here with labor unions. You have large labor unions. So to use the example of my dad, the umbrella organization that my dad belonged to is the UA, which is that United Association of Pipe Fitters and Steam Fitters and Plumbers of United States and Canada. Now, a local is when you have a specific chapter of that organization in a particular area. So you might have local, for example, my dad belonged to Local 486. That's kind of Baltimore, Maryland. You might have another local that's in New York, and they might have their own number. You might be like, hey, I'm a member of the UA, and I'm with Local 718. Oh, okay, so you're local out of Brooklyn, New York. I'm just making up that number, 718. So locals have their own specific charters, and charters are a set of rules and policies that you follow. And they ultimately take their orders from the large umbrella organization or parent organization, or in this instance, the UA. So I want to make sure that we talk about that. Now, there's been plenty of labor unions that we've seen around. The AFL-CIO, we have the Teamsters, we have the International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, we have the International Workers of the World. AFL-CIO stands for American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. So there's a bunch of labor organizations that we have, and something that we've talked about on several instances. And I don't know if this is just through lived experience, seeing that my ex-wife was a teacher and then a former middle school principal, and then one of my old neighbors was a police officer. The two most powerful unions that I've seen are police unions and teachers unions. Mm-hmm. I need everybody to walk with me here for a second. The two most powerful unions are police unions and teachers unions. Policemen are typically white men. Teachers are typically white women. So when you talk about wealth inequality, when you talk about lack of jobs for Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, and then you talk about the two most secured positions that people can have and the protections that are afforded to teachers and the protections that are afforded to police, it is an upholding and a buttressing of white supremacy.
Yes. And there it is. That I couldn't have said that any better as well. This goes back to when we've talked about this many times, but like redlining, there's like all this history, colonialism even, all this history that has sort of embedded these institutions and these systems within the government, within private, capitalistic structures of having, businesses themselves, industries as well. And so there's white supremacy embedded in all of this. And yeah, I mean, as much as I love the idea of unions, they do have their problems. And I would liken some of these large unions to sort of the like the lobbies. They're basically like really powerful lobbies. And so that system itself is also horrendously flawed and, full of bureaucracy and full of their own interests, which are always, in the interest of white supremacy in our countries, at least. And I would argue around the world too.
I would argue around the world also. And to even take it even a step further, when you talk about labor unions, the fundamental purpose of a labor union is that labor unions are supposed to be democratic.
Right.
So it's supposed to be, hey, it's, if you've ever seen the movie Star Trek Part 3, there's a part of Star Trek Part 3 where Spock is in this cylinder and it's filling up with gas, and Captain Kirk is on the outside. And Spock says to Captain Kirk, logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And then Captain Kirk looks at him and says, or the one. And that was basically the end of the scene. When you talk about a labor union, logic would dictate that the needs of the many are supposed to outweigh the needs of the few. When you talk about, and again, it's supposed to be a democratic process. When you think about democracy, we should look no further than Washington, D.C., or in your instance, Ottawa. And how the needs of the many are supposed to be met, not the needs of the few. Sometimes in labor unions, and especially with our governments, we're seeing that the needs of the few are being met and the needs of the many are being completely ignored and disavowed and not being paid any attention to. This is another problem with labor unions, because you have labor union representatives that could potentially take their marching orders from a few people in the labor force, as opposed to taking their marching orders from the majority. So again, we want to make sure that when you bring in labor union representatives, which quite honestly is really not much different than having a person in government representing you, because a labor representative represents a group of people in a particular industry. A member of the House of Representatives represents a particular group of people in a particular community. That particular group of people in a particular community is quite honestly not that much different than a particular group of people in a labor force or an industry. And in many instances, the members of that labor force are also members of that particular community. So labor and government are inextricably linked towards the betterment of our society. So when we talk about having labor practices, and we talked about this in another episode, having populist policies that serve the public. When you talk about populist policies that serve the public, they are also rooted in workers' rights and labor rights. So for the better part of, 9 or 10 months now, I've been like, yo, we need to go on strike. Why? Because if you stop working, government is going to have to respond. And if government doesn't do what we need to do, then labor must continue to not work until government does right by the majority, which are the working people of this country and your beloved country.
Yes, absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah. I mean, I could get into some definitions of Marxism right now, but I think it's more important that we talk about unemployment first, because I mean, we're in the middle, or we're in a pandemic. We're almost a year into it.
We are.
This is really impacting people just like you and I. Unemployment is rampant in our countries.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And unemployment is defined as people who aren't working.
Yeah.
And in addition to people who aren't working, there are people who are available to work and want to work, and they're ready to work. And they've looked for work recently, typically within the past 4 weeks or a month or so, give or take a couple of days. Yeah. When, I'm on unemployment now, I got no problems admitting that because I'm not working. And every time I fill out my unemployment or go on the app and click those buttons in the boxes so I get my unemployment money disbursed to me every week. I have to answer questions. And one of the questions is, hey, were you ready and available to work?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Did you refuse any offers for work? No. Have you looked for work in the past 30 days? Yes. That is the classic definition of unemployment. Now, there are plenty of people who are working, but they're not necessarily working in their particular field, or they are working fewer hours than they would like, or they're not using their skills to their full capacity or full abilities.
Right.
Those people are what we call underemployed.
Yeah.
So you have a whole bunch of cats out here that are unemployed, no work. Then you have a whole bunch of people who were computer software engineers that are now driving Uber.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have some drywall contractors because the housing market is dried up and they're now delivering your dinners via DoorDash. That's underemployed.
Yeah, and I would put myself in that category. I am one of the few people that I know that gets to say that I do what I went to school for, which I absolutely love.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in sort of a precarious position because I'm on contract, and my contracts are usually only a few months long.
Yep.
So it's precarious. I'm
Mm-hmm.
also working like far less than full-time hours, which is like I have the availability and capacity to work full time, but I'm unable to do so right now. So because of the work or the contracts that I have. And so, yeah, I mean, this is an issue for not only you and I, this unemployment and underemployment. This is a rampant issue. And I think that the underemployment is a really important one because it skews the statistics that we get about unemployment vastly, because a lot of people can get a part-time job.
Sure,
I mean, if you're educated with, a degree, a master's degree, a PhD, whatever, you can still get a job at McDonald's if you can't find employment in your field. You can be a part-time worker at, whatever place like down the road. If you
Target, Walmart, Superstore.
Of course. Yeah. And that means you're employed according to the government, but you're totally underemployed.
Absolutely.
So.
And we have some comments in the chat right now. Here, let's go ahead and a couple of them. After Eric saying, yo, what's going on, Eric?
Hello.
After Mitch saying, I'm a laid off chef I'm in Alberta, Canada. Yeah, see? Laid off
out
cat.
to Alberta. That's my home province.
Mm-hmm. We know Alberta quite well. We absolutely do. To Kenny Fisher, otherwise known as Kenny99, saying facts. And Kenny saying, hey, look, I went from working 80 hours in 2 weeks to barely 50 in 2 weeks.
Right. Yeah. And so that's exactly what we're talking about. And this is like, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, for participating, because this is exactly what we're talking about. Like, it's not just the unemployment rate that you hear on the news that doesn't really mean anything to people when they rattle off some percentage that's usually perceived as pretty low. Pardon me, but this is impacting human beings. This is a huge, pardon me, vast issue for us in Canada and the US. Absolutely. And across the world right now because of the pandemic.
Because of the pandemic. And there are 3 types of unemployment. 3 types of unemployment. First type is cyclical, where you have the contraction of the business cycle. So business is booming and then whoops, shrinks. You have frictional, where workers leave old jobs, but they are not able to find new jobs. And then you have structural unemployment. And structural unemployment happens when you have an economic shift in the economy, and it creates a mismatch between workers and their particular skills that are needed by employers. So let's go ahead and give some examples. Structural unemployment. I mentioned automobile. I mentioned automobile manufacturing. My hometown of Baltimore used to have a General Motors automobile factory on Broning Highway, and eventually robots came in and began to do what human beings could do, and robots did it more efficiently. There's a whole lot of people that were working good union-waged General Motors jobs building car parts on the east side of Baltimore, just not in Hamden, but in Highlandtown, Dundalk area, that are without work because robots replaced them. Structural unemployment. Frictional unemployment. Hey, you know what? I'm looking. I left a job and I'm looking for a new one, or I've never had a job before in a professional setting, and this is my first job. Typically, you see people coming out of college, frictional unemployment, because they've gone from working at a pita pit to now working in an office as a program analyst. It's like, whoa, okay, that's a big shift in work. That's a different thing. Layoffs. If you've ever been laid off, or as my English brethren and sistren would say, made redundant. Ever been made redundant? That's another way of saying you've been laid off. If you've been made redundant or laid off, that is a type of frictional unemployment. It's like, well, hey, what are you going to do now? Now, a perfect example of cyclical unemployment, when the market just shrinks, it's right now, coronavirus.
Exactly.
You're seeing it right now. And it's a total shutdown. And the reason why cyclical unemployment is terrible, and we got about 13 minutes left, is what happens is, in this instance with the coronavirus, the government said, yo, businesses, y'all got to shut down. Close them up. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. Why? Government says, hey, because we say so, it's a public health issue. So as a result, demand for goods and services just drops off the face of the earth, drops off dramatically. So now, as a result of demand for goods and services falling off the face of the earth, businesses have to lay off workers or make them redundant. And some businesses, because of the dramatic drop off in revenue or demand for goods and services, have to close their doors permanently.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a laid off worker, your earning power has decreased dramatically. They're not making the same money as you used to. So what are you now doing? You're now spending less money. As a result, because these laid off workers are now spending less money because they're not sure when they're going to be getting another job again, you have lower consumer spending across the board. Yeah. And that lower consumer spending further decreases a dwindling demand for goods and services across all the industries. So if you are, let's say you are a waiter, you're a waiter and you wait tables, and your restaurant was told to close their doors. And it's a small mom and pop restaurant. And then now the restaurant says, you know what, Catherine, sorry, we got to close up shop. We had a really good run at this Indian restaurant. The samosas were awesome. The naan was wonderful. The aloo chaat was amazing, but you know what? We got to close our doors. So now you're like, okay, thanks. I appreciate all the good times. Send me a couple of recipes and I'll see you hopefully down the road. So you're now holding on to all your loonies and toonies at this point because you're not spending any money. You don't have money to go out and go to the bar, or you don't have money to buy all the fancy clothes because you got to hold on to your money. Now, the one way that is proven to stop this sort of consistent economic downturn is government intervention. The government has to step in order to prevent what is called an economic depression or an economic recession.
Right.
We've seen this before. There is evidence of this. Look at what happened in 1929 with the Great Depression and the stock market crash. The government said, hey, you know what? We need to do something about this. We're going to create a jobs program, and we're going to make sure that people go back to school. Oh, and you know what else we'll do after that? We'll give everybody health care. Mm-hmm. Okay? The New Deal. Now look at what is happening now. Look what's happening now with this massive economic downturn. And you hear that phrase used frequently, economic downturn, because that's what it is. It's an economic downturn. It's a spiral downward. Mm-hmm. And what has the government tried to do? Not only your government, but my government. What has our government tried to do? Well, at least your government was a bit more conscientious about it with the CERB and the UI, but that's dwindling as we speak.
It's done. They tried for a few months. The CERB payments, which was granting those who lost their jobs because of COVID-19 pandemic, they provided those folks $2,000 a month, which is a living wage, which I would just like to put in here that the disability in Canada is less than that. So I think that we need to raise the disability amount, but that's an aside. Yeah, so they gave that, and they've also done a few things for small businesses, but it's not enough. It's the small businesses are in the form of a loans, and they have to be paid back within 2 years. And it is, yeah, it's not as good as we'd like it to be, but it's something.
It's something.
A little bit more than what your government has done.
I agree. And you take a look at what our government has done. When you look at the CARES Act, which was back in March, $600 a week additional on top of your state unemployment. What happened? If you look at all the economic data, it said, hey, you know what? Poverty levels decreased as a result of this extra $600 plus whatever people were getting added on to their state benefits. And it also increased consumer spending. Oh, wow. If you increase consumer spending by giving people money to spend, you could potentially stave off or avoid an economic recession or depression. So what happened a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks ago? Federal government said, yo, you know what? We're giving you all $600 stimulus checks, and then we'll give you $300 a week on top of what your state's giving you until April 10th, or I think until March 10th, something like that. Okay, well, what happens after that? What are we going to do after that? What are we going to do in 90 days when people still don't have work and the vaccine hasn't been implemented and rolled out properly? What are we going to do then? So the best way to prevent cyclical unemployment is the only way, unless you have a winning lottery ticket. And if I do win the lottery, I will make sure I share some of my winnings with you, Kat, because
same.
that's just what it is. We're a team. You know what I'm saying? That's just what it is.
Yeah, we gotta practice what we preach with the community care stuff.
Exactly,
for sure.
exactly. And this lottery is $400 million. I can do some things with $400 million.
Girl,
after taxes, that's like, $250 million. I can make some moves with $250 million. I can dramatically impact a few people's lives here and there with $250 million. I can do a couple of things, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we don't want to make sure that we stay on the straight and narrow. But yeah, the best way to avoid cyclical unemployment is government intervention, and our governments across the board need to be doing more. And there's plenty of governments that have been doing wonderful things for their citizens. You see that a lot in Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. They've been taking care of their people.
Yeah.
Germany, they've been issuing good monthly payments to make sure that their employees and their citizens have backstopped their wages. So, hey, you know what? Yeah, we got our wages taken care of. And guess what? In all of those countries, guess what they all have?
Universal health care.
Universal health care. Yeah.
I was just going to say, these countries have an infrastructure there that enables them to do that. And that's what we need in our countries. Because, Canada's got universal healthcare as well, but there's a lot of infrastructure that is missing here and in the US as well that we need to implement.
Absolutely. A couple more comments. Mitch was saying I was at 60 plus hours until we went into a second wave lockdown. It's crazy. Yeah. Kenny Fisher saying it's gross, Mitch. I feel gutted. I think there's a lot of people that feel gutted, Kenny, for real.
Yeah.
Mitch, and being in a resort town with high rent and food costs on regular EI, it's been a challenge for sure.
Yeah, and not to mention the risk goes up for those of you who live in towns like that. I mean, it's not only are you trying to make a living and a livelihood by keeping your jobs, but you're putting yourselves at risk in order to do so, all in the name of capitalism, which is something I'm very critical of, and I maintain that position. And I wish we had time to get into it further. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about it a lot in previous episodes too. And yeah, I mean, there's always sort of a more complex way to look at these issues that we choose as topics. And one thing that comes to mind too when you were speaking, Joe, is just that, when small businesses close, like many of them have had to do, those who do have money and need essential things are turning to places like Amazon because they have the infrastructure to deliver things quickly and efficiently. Yes. And that's putting small businesses in a position where they will never be able to open up. And it's making the richest people in the world richer, which I think is a huge, huge issue. And it's making the class divisions, the rich versus poor divisions, so much bigger. And that is one thing that is coming from this pandemic that we need to examine immediately. It's no longer okay. We can't allow this to happen anymore.
You know what, Kat? I would go even a bit further. I would even say we're past the point of examination, because we already know that, as I said earlier, these centibillionaire oligarchs.
Yeah.
There's, in an egalitarian society, billionaires should not exist. So there's no way you should be worth $100+ billion.
Agreed.
Or in the instance of Jeff Bezos, he's closing in on $200 billion. What? No.
That amount of zeros is not fathomable to me. It does not compute. Meanwhile, those of us who are in precarious positions, like most of the country, most of the world. I mean, we're counting every penny just to put food on our tables, to, maintain our housing. Some people are living in the parks because they can't. Like, this is wild to me. It is wild to me that people allow and accept the system that we have that upholds these menacing figures like Jeff Bezos, and wrapped up in it is white supremacy, wrapped up in it is patriarchy, all of the isms that come from those things.
Yep.
We've talked about all of this stuff before, and it really gets us worked up, and me in particular, clearly.
I agree.
But it's because they're so, embedded within each other and interconnected and intersectional, it's all so connected.
I agree.
It's frustrating to talk about this stuff because it does impact us, you and I, and those in the chat, and everybody else who might listen to this after. It's really impacting our lives. And it seems like the government doesn't care or doesn't want to do anything because they are out of touch, which is also something that we've talked about before.
Absolutely. In the words of Hall and Oates, they're out of touch and they're out of time.
Yeah.
Out of
touch.
Yeah,
truly.
Out of time. A couple more comments. Man, Edward Brown, what's up, Ed? So get him, brother. Man, I haven't seen Ed in a long time. He used to live right around the corner from where I used to live in my old parents' house. Good brother right there. Sadir Joof, my main man Cora was saying facts. Absolutely. We and him had a nice chat yesterday. Good chat with that brother right there. Couple more types of unemployment. We got to wrap this up. We're coming up on 60 minutes. Natural unemployment happens when you have frictional unemployment and structural unemployment.
Right.
Also has seasonal unemployment. That is what it is. So you can't be an ice cream vendor in the wintertime.
Right.
Doesn't make sense. That's seasonal. You can't be cutting grass in the wintertime. I mean, especially where there's snow. How are you going to cut grass in the snow? But then you switch it up. So instead of cutting grass, you shovel snow or you plow streets. Okay. And then there's a couple other types of workers and types of unemployment that we want to outline, because this is also important to calculating the unemployment statistics. You have marginally attached workers. Marginally attached workers are workers that have not looked for work in the past 4 weeks, but have looked for work in the past year. Right. You have discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are people who want a job, but they're not necessarily looking for a job because they can't find a job that matches their skills, or they feel that they've been discriminated against. Now, when you calculate the unemployment rate, marginally attached workers and discouraged workers are added to that statistic. And I know we got about 90 seconds left. Long-term unemployed is the third type of unemployed person, and these are people who have looked for work in the past 4 weeks, but have been out of work for the last 27 weeks.
Right.
Long-term unemployed, and there's a whole lot of them as a result of this pandemic, are not counted towards unemployment statistics. So if you see unemployment numbers put out in America, but they say, oh, unemployment's at 8 or 9%, that is bullshit. Double it.
Way higher. Yeah.
Way higher.
Yeah, and yeah, that doesn't include, like our discussion before, the underemployment as well. Like these numbers are seemingly low, and they're announcing those numbers on the news for a reason, because they want you to think that it's not as big of an issue as it actually is. Absolutely. So, Joe, we're running out of time, so I just want to thank you so much. I know there's so much more to be said, but thank you again for another amazing conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, sister. And we'll be back together again in a few hours for fair and loving. I want to thank everybody that participated in the chat. Out to Mitch, out to Edward, out to Coro, out to Kenny99. You know what it is. We're here for everybody, and we're here for each of you. We love what we do, and we love each of you, and we care about each of you. If you like what we're doing, tell a friend. If you don't like what we're doing, tell us. We're adults. We're adults. We can talk about it.
Tell us how to switch it up.
Switch it up. We can talk about it. Next week's episode, Biden and his cabinet, episode number 32, everybody. We gotta go.
All right. Goodbye.
All right. Peace.